Um, it's interesting. The pastor, you all were in the first service, right? I always, when you talk about that that subject about, what does it mean, to how does being a believer change your life? How does it, you know, um, and I always kind of likened it to, um, I always kind of likened it to when a man, a male becomes a father. Okay, when a male becomes a father, that's kind of a way to illustrate the change. It doesn't work as much for women because obviously women have the baby and there's a physical element to it there, where there is no physical element to it for the father. I mean, when the baby is born, the father is the exact same person he was 5 minutes before. Height's the same, weight's the same, body's the same, desires are the same. Nothing changes physically for the father when a baby is born. Um, but when the first time a new father, looks at his child, he is changed somehow. Um, something is different, and those of us who are fathers know what that is. If something is different, something has changed, and you can't put your finger on what it is, but something is different. And if something isn't different, if something hasn't changed, then we think that's wrong, right? I mean, think of the derelict fathers or the deadbeat dads kind of thing. We think that's wrong, kind of thing. Something is wrong. And I've always, what does it mean to have the Holy Spirit indwelling? Again, this has nothing to do with James or Job for that matter, James or Job. Um, but yeah, that's free. That's your free. This is the post sermon commentary kind of thing, where I comment on the pastor's illustrations and the analyses and all of that. It's the post show. Like if you used to watch the Cubs games, it was the 11th. Remember the 11th inning? Anybody watch? Is it the 11th inning or the 10th inning? The 10th inning. The 10th inning was what they called it. They had a post show interview with the players. So this is the 10th inning. All right, welcome back. Today is January 18th. It was on this date in 532 AD that the Nika rebellion was crushed by the Emperor Justinian I. Now the Nika rebellion. Now this takes place in Constantinople, which is now called Istanbul, and there's a hippodrome. It's called a hippodrome, which is basically a big race course. Okay, it's a big long narrow thing, and there's a line in the middle. And if you've seen Ben Hur, it's the chariot races, and so they would have chariot races. And in Constantinople, the chariot races were divided up into four different, let's call them teams. There were the blue, greens, reds, and yellows. That's what they were called, the blues and the greens. And over the course of time, the yellows and the greens kind of fell away, so it was just the blues and the reds. So there were two teams supported. So there were the blue favorite and there was the red favorite. Um, and they became quite powerful, these factions, that they started getting like, okay, well, this was a big public event. Now again, Constantinople was not as big. It wasn't like a 5 million city population city. So these groups would get together and somebody would say, hey, since we're all here, let's talk about politics, kind of thing. And they got to be a sort of political. They would support political candidates, and it kind of sort of got that way. And so in 532, people were kind of upset with Justinian, and they started in between races. They would start chanting because the hippodrome was right outside the palace, so that the emperor could kind of walk out of the palace and look out over the races, sort of thing. So it's sort of a public thing for the emperor to do. And so the emperor would come out and would kind of say, okay, and sometimes he would throw ducats one way or the other and say, oh, you're on my side, or I'm helping the blues, I'm helping the greens today, kind of thing. But the bottom line is, it got to the point, in between races, people would start shouting to the emperor, hey, do something about prices, do something about this, do something about the bad internet coverage here, kind of thing. And by this particular time, it had gotten quite vocal to the point of where they drowned out the race, and they kind of gave up on the race. And so there were like 50, 60, 70,000 people in that Coliseum there, or that hippodrome, chanting, and it got to be a thing where it was like, down with the emperor, down with the emperor, give us a new emperor, and there was somebody else that they were chanting for, kind of thing. And Justinian was this close to abdicating, abdicating. I mean, he was like packing his bags, and he had the route planned, and the horses were ready, and everything was going. And his wife, Theodora, said, "Oh no, you're not, because I am not." Basically, she just said, "I am a queen or empress, and I am not going to die anything but an empress." So he said, "You get on the phone and call your generals and get in there and tell them to quell the rebellion." And they did. And the estimates are that up to 30,000 people were killed. So it's the Nika, which literally means victory. It's the victory revolution. But they killed up to 30,000 people, and 1/3 of the city was burned, including the temple, or not the temple, the church that had been built previously. And so Justinian came in and rebuilt this as a result of that. And that's where the what's called the Hagia Sophia, or the Hagia Sophia, if you've ever seen it. It's like one of the oldest Christian churches. It's now an Islamic mosque, but for 1,000 years it was. And so this was sort of it's a huge deal in the history of Constantinople, the Nika revolt. But that was on this date in 532. Almost 1,000 years later, in 1525, after public debate the day prior between the Anabaptists and Zwingli, okay, the Zurich City Council mandated that all infants needed to be baptized within 8 days. So in Zwingli's defense, or to his credit, he said, all right, you guys, if you remember, Zwingli was the guy that said, we need to throw out everything that's not in the Bible and only take what's in the Bible. The one exception to that was infant baptism. And the Anabaptists, Grable, Mons, forget the other one, said, wait a minute, where is infant baptism in the Bible? He said, well, we'll have a public debate about this. And then the city council, which ran the church and the city council, was going to vote on whether infants needed to be baptized. And so they voted, and they said within 8 days, every infant needs to be baptized. And so the Anabaptists were the three main Anabaptists. Blaurock is the other one. Mons, Blaurock, Grable. Within, I think it's 2 years, all three of those had been killed. Those guys had been killed. The Anabaptists didn't stop, but that was kind of the start of the persecution of them in 1525. Captain James Cook discovered the Sandwich Islands today, on this date in 1778. What do we call the Sandwich Islands today? Anybody know? No. Hawaii. The Hawaiian Islands. Or as my dad would like to put it, he didn't discover them, they were never lost. Speaking of the British, it was on this date in 1788 that 736 British prisoners arrived in Botany Bay to set up a penal colony. What do we call that penal colony today? Anybody know? Close. No, not close. Australia. Australia was set up as a penal colony. Georgia was the colony that was set up as a penal colony in the U.S. In 1871, the Second German Empire was announced by Kaiser Wilhelm I and Otto von Bismarck. That was the Second Reich, to be followed by the Third Reich, which is what Hitler set up. On this date in 1918, Louisa M. Arstead, a missionary to Zimbabwe, died. She had been there for quite some time. She was a hymn writer. She wrote the song, "'Tis so sweet to trust in Jesus, just to take him at his word, just to rest upon his promise," etc., etc. And it was on this date in 1920 that Peter Nika gave his heart to Jesus. And he was so enthusiastic about him that people around him thought he was drunk. But Peter Nika, ultimately, he was Russian or Ukrainian. He founded the Russian Gospel Association, And the Russian Gospel Association reached out and set up things in South America, including Russian Bible Institutes, which is where somebody's father went from Poland and met somebody's mother, and they got married, and then they came to the United States, and they had a daughter, and there she is right there, kind of thing. So that was as a result of Peter on this date in 1920. And finally, for those of you who remember, it was on this date in 1974 that the $6 Million Man premiered. How many remember watching the $6 Million Man? Right? We all know that the sound is in your head right now. That dun, 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 kind of thing. Yeah, it was on this date there. So, all right, that's it for on this date. Let's today we're going to talk about Job. All right, so remember, we are going through the Bible one book at a time. It is the Book a Week Bible study. So far we've talked about Leviticus and Genesis. Today we're going to talk about Job. Next week we're going to talk about Exodus. We have, again, as you read the book, you just check off the book. Okay, so Job, I read it. Took me a little over an hour to do. If you want to listen to it, if you want to read it, however, we have Exodus. And then again, I'll be gone for 2 weeks. So if you haven't caught it, there's a great chance to. But again, you just start at any time because we're not doing them in order. So it's just at the end of the year, you can look back and see what you've marked off. You can say, yep, once again, I've read through the Bible. So the question is, why are we talking about Job now? Okay, why are we talking about Job now? Why don't we just wait until we get to Hebrew or, for 2 Samuel, for 2 Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job? Why don't we wait till then? Well, there's a couple of reasons. Mostly because many believe that Job, the person, and the events of the story are contemporaneous with Abraham, meaning happened around the same time as Abraham, okay? Or it's pre-covenant. It's a very early story. Some have suggested it's one of the earliest stories or myths. And now that I don't say that as a bad word. Myth is it's a broader term than simply something that's not true. But it's one of the earliest stories of the biblical era, biblical epic. So why? Why do we say that? Well, there are no Jewish references in there. There's no references to Job being from Israel or a Jew or a covenant. There's no references to a temple. And it's an agrarian economy. What makes Job rich is the number of cows and number of, that's cows and sheep and all of that. Number of kids. These are the things that are the measures of wealth. There isn't a bank. Is it money, which suggests that it's less of a, that it's before any of that has been developed. Okay. Now, there's a couple of different ways to look at that, but that's a very common, probably the most prevalent view of Job, and that is to say that, okay, it's a very old story, okay? Tale as old as time, sort of thing, okay? But that leads me into, there's 3 ways to look at the book of Job, okay? Three ways to say, okay, what is this story about, and how you look at it matters based on some of the details, especially if we get to the bottom where we talk about the persons involved. 3 ways to look at the book of Job. 1, it's a historical event. Okay, it's a historical event. It happened just as it was written. Okay, so there's this guy named Job. He's a rich guy. He loses everything. And we have this story of something going on in heaven. I think most of us are familiar with the story of Job. And that's exactly what happened. It happened just as it was written. A second way to look at it is to say that it is a dramatized version of a real event. Okay, I don't know if anybody has ever read anything by Truman Capote, the writer Truman Capote. He wrote the In Cold Blood, and I forget what it was called, where he wrote nonfiction that read like fiction. And that was one of the things about that particular story. Okay, it was a real story, but the way he wrote it, it's like you're reading a fiction story, even though it's an actual event. And I think nowadays most writers are like that. They try to write, even if it's a real event, they try to write it in such a way that, with elements of fiction, characters and things. And sometimes they go a little weird. I don't know if you remember when President Reagan after he had left office, there was a guy named Edmund Morris, who's a very well known, very respected writer. I think he's a Pulitzer Prize winner. Um, was going to write the authoritative, the authorized biography of President Reagan. And what he did in writing this story is he literally wrote himself into the story. He just said things like, meetings were taking place, and he would say, as the writer, I was in the back of the room, or something, some weird way that he wrote himself into the story. Um, and that was his way of saying, no, I'm not changing the events. I'm just, this way can kind of show you the, kind of thing. But it didn't go over very well. Okay, and so it just, there was a lot of controversy over it at the time when he did that. But again, you can say it's a dramatized version of a real event. Or the third way to look at it is to say it is a full dramatization. It's a parable. Okay, that there never was actually a person named Job. Okay, um, it's a it's a dramatization. It's a parable. It's just a story that people made. Somebody made up this story. Now, there are problems with each of these versions. Okay, and it kind of gets into the, okay, so if you say, oh, it's a historical event, it happened just as it hurt. Okay, then we have this problem, that you have the Satan problem. What is Satan doing in heaven? Okay, we'll talk about that. Okay, or is this really how God works? Okay, whereas if it's a dramatized version, maybe somebody looked back and you see this kind of stuff happen where somebody um, writes a story about a person, and it's a real person, but they may or may not have done that. It's, oh, what would this person have done? This character shows up. Okay, so for example, I remember we back in the day we used to watch Star Trek: The Next Generation. Any Star Trek fans in here? Okay. We used to watch Star Trek: The Next Generation, and one season they had an episode where they went back in time and they met Mark Twain. Is in this particular story. Okay, so Mark Twain's a real person, and I am pretty certain that he never met anybody from a spaceship. I'm not 100% certain because I wasn't there, but a real person put into this for verisimilitude. We were at Debbie and I were at a murder mystery thing last night, and at Wheaton, at Cantini in Wheaton, which was interesting. I had it all figured out as far as who the killer was. I had it. Here's why. Here's who did it. Here's why. Here's how. Exactly, and it was logical. It made sense. It fit all of the facts, and it was wrong. Which is pretty much most of my theories. It's like a very, I'm especially good with political prognostications. So basically, come up and ask me near election time who's going to win, and I will explain to you why a certain person is going to win. And then just my recommendation is bet against it, because I'm rarely ever right on that. I have all these reasons why it's going to happen this way, but it doesn't. But one of the characters in that, well, there are a couple of characters in. Has anybody done one of these, like a full-on one where they pay? There's like a group of actors that kind of put it on, and one of the actors was Ken Lay, the guy who was running Enron. This was set in 1997, so there was Ken Lay, this real person, and Posh Spice, one of the Spice Girls, was another one of the characters. And they, so I thought it's probably not them, because it's not likely that they would make a real person the killer in this. So I was right about that. But be that as it may, so maybe somebody said, "Oh yeah, you remember that story about that guy named Job who lost everything and then 2 years later got it all back again? I wonder how that worked." And then they just kind of filled in the blank with it. And if you say, well, it's a full dramatization, then if it's a parable, you've got a couple of problems. There is a couple of references, at least one, to Job in other parts of the Old Testament where they talk about Job and this, and you say, well, Job is never presented in the text as being as being a parable. Okay, so the text doesn't say this is a parable; it just says there was a person named Job. So any one of these. So I say these three different ways that you can take any one of these three and still be, to me, you can still be within, a high view of Scripture. It's this is not a necessarily, if somebody comes in and says, well, I think Job is more of a parable for us. I don't think that's necessarily a die heretic moment. Um, because again, we want to kind of manage, how we view this. But those are the three most common ways of looking at Job. What is the purpose of the book? What is the purpose of the book of Job? Well, the purpose of the book of Job is to address, and there's several different ways to put it, the theodicy problem. The theodicy problem. Theodicy. Theodicy. The theodicy problem, or just theodicy in general, is the question: why do bad things happen to good people? That is the theodicy problem. If God is all powerful and God is all loving, why do people go to hell? Why do bad things happen? Okay, so we look around and we see, yes, bad things are happening. There are people that are dying. There are people that are suffering through no cause of their own. Why do bad things? And that's called the theodicy problem. All right. And there are books, and we could take a whole, you know, several weeks to kind of talk about the theodicy problem. There's several approaches to the theodicy problem. Couple of the quickest responses. There's the John Calvin response to the theodicy problem. Why do bad things happen to innocent people? Okay, so the John Calvin response, and I'm assuming, I don't know that John Calvin ever actually said this in this context, but the John Calvin response is, there are no innocent people. Period. There are no innocent people. So it isn't a question of why do bad things happen to good people. There are no good people. We are all fallen sinners. So that's kind of one way. Another way, another fairly common one, and one most of us would probably ascribe to, is that it's the effect of sin. Okay, that God created the world good. He created it with perfectly, and man and woman, I forget how I put it last week, they're the ones that screwed it up. So as a result, sin entered the world, and sin fundamentally changed everything. Okay, so the only problem with that is when you get into, you have to take a very and I'm not against this. I'm just saying you have to take a very expansive view of sin and say how can you say sin caused hurricanes? How can you say that sin caused earthquakes, things like that? And nowadays we can say, well, humans have been burning fossil fuels and it ruined the environment and all of that, and that's certainly true. But you go back in history and say, well, what about Pompeii? Okay, so there were a lot of innocent people there. How did that? Then you back to, well, the people weren't innocent that died. Okay, but again, it's a question that we all wrestle with, and the bottom line is there isn't a good answer. Okay, there isn't really an answer that's going to satisfy. That's going to go, oh, okay. It's one of those where we just trust God, which essentially is what Job ends up doing. Okay, and we'll get to that. So the purpose of the book is the theodicy problem. Does it answer the problem? No, it really doesn't. Okay, you just when we get to the end of the book, and we'll show the video here in a second, and you'll see that we get to the end of the book, and Job is never given an answer. It is in the book. It's never explained to Job why what happened to him happened to him. He's never given an answer in that. Okay, so does it answer the theodicy problem? No, it does not. One of the things I wanted to talk about here at this point, I just wanted to look at one passage. uh, again, now we were talking about the literary outlines or the literary approach to the Old Testament, and somebody was asking, this is the book that I was talking about, the literary structure of the Old Testament by David Dorsey. Okay, so it's a commentary, and he goes through every book in the Old Testament and says the Hebrew writing has a certain chiastic structure to it. Okay, and a chiastic structure is that where things are paired up, and you kind of see that with Job because you have the opening scene. So the two opening scenes, how they match up, are very easily seen. For he has 10 kids and 10,000 sheep, and at the end he's got 10 kids and 10,000 sheep. You see this balance that it's put in there. And some people have argued one of the things that makes this a dramatic retelling or even a parable is how neatly they match up. Okay, that suddenly Job loses 10 kids, he has 10 kids, he has 10 more kids. He had 10,000 sheep, he ends up with 20,000 sheep, because I think he ends up with double, doesn't he? Kind of the details. But in your handout, I have the outline, and of course, he goes through, Dorsey goes through it in much more detail. It's really kind of a fascinating way to look at I had it printed out. What did I do with it? Oh, here. Yeah, here the whole book. So the book opens with Job's suffering and then ends with Job's suffering reversed. So you see how those things match. Then you have Job's introductory speech. Oh, he wishes, and then this is in chapter 3 where he says, "Oh, I wish I had never been born," kind of thing. And then it's paired with God's closing speech. Okay, this is where God, where were you when I created the world? You know what this is, you know what that is. And then in the interior, the C and the C prime are the cycles of speeches. You have, what is it? Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar on the one end, and then there's paired with the cycle of summation speeches, which is where you've got Elihu comes in, and then God's closing speech, Elihu comes in, who's a fourth friend, who he waltzes in, and says, "Listen, I didn't say anything because I'm younger, but I got this figured out," kind of thing. So, but the center is chapter 28. Okay, the chapter 28, and that is a separate poem. And if you read it in the text, you'll see that 28 kind of abruptly changes subject if you're reading through, and then when it ends, it says, chapter 29, verse 1, Job continued his discourse. So like it seems pretty clear, and I think I'm told that in the Hebrew itself, it's a little clearer that this is set off. And so many have argued that chapter 28 is the author's writing. This is the author's kind of setting everybody straight and saying, okay, listen, this is the point. Okay, remember we talked about narrative texts, that it's when the most, that when the narrator is telling you something, if you believe inspiration, when the narrator says this is what happened, then you can trust that that's what happened. But when the narrator quotes someone, all that the narrator is vouching for is that person said that. Okay, in terms, especially in the Old Testament, verifying what the text says. But some looked and said, okay, this is the narrator in chapter 28, and it's talking about a search for wisdom, and it sounds a lot like Proverbs kind of thing. But and I just want to look at chapter 28 for a minute. Chapter 28 says, "There is a mine for silver and a place where gold is refined. Iron is taken from the earth and copper is smelted from one." So again, prior to this, there's been no mention of gold or anything. And then all of a sudden, 28, boom, we've got all of this gold, which kind of says, okay, the later writer who's putting this together kind of inserts this. Then later on, there's no, when Job gets everything back, he doesn't get back a bunch of gold. Okay, but so this tends to stand out. Mortals put an end to the darkness. They search out the farthest recesses for ore in the blackest darkness. So the first part of chapter 28 talks about the length that people will go to get valuable things. Okay, They go to the dark, okay? Far from human dwellings, they cut a shaft. In places untouched by human feet, far from other people, they dangle and sway. This is how much effort they will go to get valuable things. The earth from which food comes is transformed below as by fire. Lapis lazuli comes from the rocks. That's it. The blue stone, blue stone. Proud beasts do not set foot, no lion prowls there. People assault the flinty rock with their hands. Okay, how talking about the amount of effort people will go to. You think of panning for gold, kind of going into flinty rock with their hands. They search the sources of the rivers and bringing things to light. But verse 12, where can wisdom be found? Okay, where can wisdom be found? Because Job is looking for wisdom. He's like, why is all this happening? And the readers of this book are looking for this. Where is this wisdom found? Where does understanding dwell? Okay. So really you look at it, our desire for value is insatiable. We always want, the old saying, it's alleged that somebody asked John D. Rockefeller how much money is enough. And he's alleged to have replied a little more, kind of thing. What about our desire for wisdom and understanding? How far are we willing to go for that? No mortal comprehends its worth. It cannot be found in the land of the living. And now it goes through. The deep says it's not in me. The sea says it's not with me. It cannot be bought with the finest gold, nor can its price be weighed out in silver. It cannot be bought with the gold of Ophir, with precious onyx, or lapis lazuli. Neither gold nor crystal can compare with it, nor can it be had for jewels of gold, et cetera, going on. All these precious things can't buy wisdom. All the money in the world isn't going to get wisdom. Where then, verse 20 kind of repeats verse 12, where then does wisdom come from? Where does understanding dwell? It is hidden from the eyes of every living thing, concealed even from the birds in the sky. So I think he's kind of foretelling the fact that, hey, you're not going to get an answer. You're not going to get the wisdom you're looking for in this story. Okay. Only a rumor of it has reached our ears. God understands the way to it, and he alone knows where it dwells. Okay. So again, Job and his friends are assaulting God. They're accusing God. They're accusing Job. They're accusing each other. Okay. And now God's going to come back in the later chapters and say to the friends, you guys were wrong, man. You guys were way off base here. Okay. For he views the ends of the earth and sees everything under the heavens. So, okay, so this is kind of getting back to the perspective that God has on things. Okay, and I mean, we probably have had this happen where you have an opinion on something, okay, or some something happens, and you, based on what you say, oh well, this had to happen because of this, and then you kind of convince, and then somebody walks in and tells you something that just kind of, oh, I didn't know that. That changes everything because you don't have perfect information. Okay, I find this out. The other day, I was called to the fifth grade classroom because there was language used on the playground. Okay, so I had to I'm the principal. This is what I do, right? I go down and say, okay. So as soon as I walked in the door, the teacher says, all right, student one, go out there. Okay, use the language. So again, that's all I know. Language on the, and I say to student one, all right, what happened? Oh, everybody says I said a bad word, but I didn't really say a bad word. Okay. I'm like, okay, well, what word did you say? Well, I said, oh, heck. Okay. And so now this is why I'm there. I'm there to punish because everybody else is convinced that he said something else. Okay. So then I have to ask, all right. So I could have just said, all right, here you go, get my stick, beat him about the head and shoulders. I'm sorry, that's fantasies. I could have just stopped it at that. But I said, so why did you say, oh heck? What caused that? He said, well, so and so threw a snowball at me. Why did he throw a snowball at you? I don't know. Really? You were just sitting there behaving yourself? Uh-huh. You weren't doing a thing? No. So you were just sitting in a chair with your hands crossed, looking at the sky, and the student, well, no. So what were you doing? I was walking. Walking from where? Walking away from the student. Well, why were you walking away? Well, because I just knocked his hat off. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. Why did you knock his hat off? Well, because he knocked my hat off. Oh, I see. Okay. So now this, again, there's just one more piece of information. And then okay, so you go back into the room, and then I get the other kid back out. And I'm having this whole conversation with fifth graders in the second grade classroom. And every time you just start asking questions, and I start, okay, did you throw a snowball at him? Yes. Why did you do that? Because he knocked my hat off. Wait a minute. He knocked your hat off? When did he knock your head off? So now I've got both of these kids are knocking each other's head off left and right, ends up with one of them saying, oh, heck, or something else. But again, getting one more piece of information, like the perspective, I was just brought in there to say, this kid swore on the playground, deal with him. Okay, wait a minute, I've got a whole big relationship thing working here that I got to get both of them out there and talking to each other sort of thing. But by the end of it, I had a much better view of what happened on the playground than I was initially led to know. For he views the end of the earth and sees everything under the heavens. When he established the force of the wind and measured out the waters, when he made a decree for the rain, and he looked, and he said to the human race, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to shun evil is understanding. Okay, so the fear of the Lord and to shun evil is understanding. So again, this is the author is telling you. The wisdom, the only wisdom you're going to get is the fear of the Lord, the understanding, and kind of what the video said at the end. It's like, okay, it's just fear God, trust God in the end, because you're not going to get the answer that you're looking for a lot of times. And that is not, I mean, that's kind of a reality, and it's easy to say when you don't have a crisis in your life. Okay, so again, this is one of those things that, so if somebody's going through a struggle, oh, why is this happening to me? There's a sickness or a death or something happens. I don't, I'd be very careful about saying, you know what, you need to read the book of Job. Okay, read the book of Job when you don't have a crisis in your life, then kind of get an understanding that somehow God is working through the situation. We may not know how. So chapter 28 is considered the kind of the center of the book. The authors that wisdom is God's to give and to keep. So the only other thing I wanted to talk about here about is and I'm calling it the dramatis personae because I'm in a theater kind of mood here. These are all the people that are involved in this particular book. Job, the accuser, God, Job's wife, who only has a small part. Job's wife, she just says, what's interesting is that Job's wife sticks with him, kind of thing. I mean, we criticize the wife because the wife says, curse God and die, right? And it's easy to criticize the wife, but she sticks with him, right? There's no record that the wife leaves, so the wife has lost everything as well. Okay, she's lost, and she's got a husband who's sitting on a sack of, who's scraping, out there, talking with his friends while she's broke, right? What am I supposed to do? You're out there talking with your friends. So, I mean, kudos to Job's wife for hanging around. The three friends, and so the gist of the story, if you haven't read it yet, okay, basically what it comes down to is Job has a bunch of stuff, he loses it, and then his three friends come in and say, you sinned. And if friend number one says, you sinned, Job says, no, I didn't. Friend number two says, you sinned. And Job says, no, I didn't. And friend number three says, you sinned. And Job says, no, I didn't. Okay. And then fourth friend, Elihu, comes in and says, you sinned. And Job says, no, I didn't. Okay, there you go. That is the world's fastest summary of all of those verses. Where it does become important is you got to be careful anytime you use Job as a proof text for something. Okay. So it's like, oh, we know this is true because I'm going to quote Job chapter whatever. All right. You got to be careful. It's like, okay, who is that talking? Okay. Who is that talking? If it's one of the friends, well, God says the friends aren't right. And if you're using that as a proof, this is kind of the fun of proof texting stuff kind of thing. The only other thing I wanted to talk about is the accuser. And we have talked about this. Is the last thing I'll talk about today. We have talked about this before. If you remember in 1 Samuel, and I've forgotten the name now, Ahithophel. Um, so uh, David is going out of the uh, is sent out of the country, right? Absalom has too many names with A's in there. Um, is sent out of the country, and he meets Sheba, who throws rocks at him and curses him and all this kind of stuff. And then when David comes back into, he's with Ahithophel. I think it's Ahithophel. It's one of Joab's brothers. Um, and Joab and Sheba is there. Suddenly has a change of heart. Says, "Oh wait, no, this is. I'm sorry, just kidding, David. We're buddies, right?" And the friend and Ahithophel says to David, "Hey, this guy cursed you. Let me kill him." And David's response to him was in like 1 Samuel, or I don't know, 2 Samuel 27 or something like that. He says, "Who made you the accuser? Who made you Satan? Who made you the Hasatan or the Satan?" Kind of thing. And so this in the Hebrew or in this era was a legitimate position. It was kind of what we would call the devil's advocate, so to speak. There was a person there designed to bring bad news to the ruler, okay, or to call into question the wisdom of the ruler. In a lot of Shakespeare plays, you have a fool. Okay, it's called a fool, right? And what's interesting about the fool in most of Shakespeare's plays, where you see one, the fool is very often the smartest person in the room. Okay, so the fool in King Lear, which is a great play. If you haven't seen King Lear, you need to see King Lear. But the fool is the only one who's really telling Lear what he needs to hear. Okay, so it's this role, and so in the heavenly court, there's this role that's called the Hasatan, or the accuser. Okay, so it's an angel. It's somebody in the heavenly court that fulfills this particular role. It could be something that rotated. It could have been an individual person. But as the New Testament came along and started developing, the cosmology of how evil and good worked in the universe, they said, okay, well, there's clearly one accuser who is working against us in a different sense. And so they took that word and it became a name in the New Testament development of that kind of theology. So by the New Testament, when you said the word Satan, you were thinking of a person, the prince of the power of the air kind of thing, okay, the accuser of the brethren, okay? And so then what's happened is they've taken this word Satan and put it back into the Old Testament when it wasn't meant to. Okay, so when you see, and again, it doesn't, I don't know how your Bible translates it, but again, when the Bible says, when your translation says, Satan went up to God and said, what about Job? Okay, we think this, it's not, to me, okay, it's not Satan, the New Testament, the prince of darkness, okay, the evil one. Okay, it's a person holding a position. Does that make sense? So it kind of gets beyond the whole, okay, how I thought God couldn't handle evil, or evil wouldn't exist within God because of holiness and things like that. Well, it's not. It's just a person whose job it was to say, well, and you think about it, when you look at presidential administrations, I know I harp on presidential administrations, but that's always been one of my hobby horses kind of things. When you talk about especially second administrations, any history of any second administration, one of the things that happens almost without a doubt is they lose people who are willing to tell the president things he doesn't want to hear. So when a president first takes office, every president, I'm pretty certain, every president always says, oh no, I want to hear dissenting views. I want to hear dissenting views. But by the second administration, and certainly by the end of the second administration, anyone giving dissenting views, because it's hard to be the person giving a dissenting view and constantly being told no, because essentially they just kind of leave. LBJ, I forget the guy, William, I think it was William Sapphire. There was a writer, guy who became a writer, but he was in the Johnson White House. And he was very much against the Vietnam War. And so LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, the president from 63 to 69, used to call him Mr. Stop the Bombing. So he would literally just say, and Johnson was a fairly kind of crass, rough language individual. I know that's hard to believe that we would have a president like that. It's shocking. It is. But Sapphire would walk into the room and Johnson would say, "Oh, here comes Mr. Stop the Bombing," as they're going to talk about bombing Cambodia. So you can imagine if that's how, if I see Dave walk in the room and I say, "Oh, here comes Mr. I don't like anything Stan says." Okay, now how long is Dave going to continue to come into the room? If that's what here comes Mr. I don't care anything about what Stan says. Okay, I don't know. Dave's a glutton for punishment, so he may come in and say, "Yeah, I'm going to do. I take that as a challenge." But you get my point. You're not going to come around very long. But that's what this Hasatan is. It's just somebody who's, kind of gives an alternative view, and it was a common thing in royal courts to have this sort of a person or this sort of a role here. So if you look at it as a dramatized event, either a dramatized event of a real situation or a parable, it's easy to say, well, how did God light on Job? Well, the accuser told him, the Hasatan told him, kind of thing. Any questions? All right. So next week we're going to get back into talking about Exodus. So has anybody ever done a chronological read through the Bible? I know that was where's Job. Sometimes I've seen chronological where Job is first.
There's a published Bible chronological. Mm-hmm. Still out there, I think.
Is Job first, or it's early on? It's almost always early. So just chapter like Genesis 1 through 5, and then Job.
I found something interesting because I was trying to look something up, but I was looking at all the names in Job, and you can also look at the animals and any place names and such, the clues. Anyway, there is a Ram in the line of Christ. That doesn't mean it's the same Ram who was the father of, what's his name, Elihu, clan of Ram, I'm sorry. Elihu, son of Barakel, the Buzite of the clan of Ram. That doesn't mean it's the same Ram, but I mean, he's down 1, 2, 3 generations from Judah, which means he's 5 or 6 generations from Abraham. So still that sort of, I mean, I'm not saying it's the same guy.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that's
the name was around then.
The name was,
yeah.
So, and it could be the same guy, but yeah, it seems like it must be around that time, just because, like you say, that's what Abraham himself was, the same kind of rich.
Right. Well, the one point, I mean, and again, the author, at the very least, the author doesn't want to place the story within any particular context. He doesn't want you to think, oh, that's a Jewish story. Oh, that would never happen, because clearly that happened in Israel. It would never happen in my country. He's just saying, no, this is kind of a universal, by eliminating a lot of the details, it suggests, okay, this could happen anywhere, or this is just how the universe works, kind of thing. But all right, well, thank you very much, and I'll see you guys next week.
A few extra minutes. Can I ask one question?
Sure.
You started out with the 3 ways to view Job and historical dramatized event, full dramatization.
Yeah, it's a parable.
Brought in Satan is the problem with the historical event. Brought in the reference in James to the full dramatization. But what about the middle one? What is the problem with that one? It seems like that would fit nicely to all of the problems.
I don't.
Dramatized version of
Right.
the real event.
Well, the only problem that Well, the problem with the historical event, exactly as it happened, is when you say it's Satan in heaven,
Right.
okay, not the accuser.
You can
But
explain it, maybe that wasn't the case.
yeah, um, the dramatized version of a real event. No, to me, that's my favorite view of what it is. I think it's a real event. Some people would say, well, wait a minute, then isn't that, couldn't that be, if they're exaggerating or making up things, how do we know that happened? And, kind of, it's a middle ground that some people never like compromising on things. So no, to me, it's a dramatized version of a real event. I mean, someone at some point knew about this story about this guy. And if you think about it, that would be a fabulous story, especially if you keep track of these sort of things. That like the guy who created General Motors, I forget his name now. The guy who created General Motors was going along and was there for 5 or 10 years and was pushed out for a number of reasons. Okay, he was fired from General Motors, and so he went and started another company, another auto. I can't remember what it was. It wasn't a car company, but he started another car adjacent company, and ultimately, over a course of time, the car adjacent company ended up buying General Motors. And so the guy who started it used this other company to come back in and take it over. So if you know about the car business, you go, oh yeah, there's this great story kind of thing about this person who had it all, lost it all, got it back again kind of thing. Okay. So again, you all didn't know that. None of you knew that because you weren't ever in the car business, but I was. So I know this kind of stuff. So people at that time would have, remember that story about that rich guy? I wonder how that happened. And maybe there were stories, maybe there were explanations, and somebody sat down and this is probably how it went.
Well, I always thought about two things. The first thing is, I think all the speeches are written as poetry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the whole thing is.
So if you took the action out, it would be a very short story.
Yeah.
If you just took what happened and what happened next, it would be super short. But then it's just all these volumes of speeches.
And they're all very structured. I mean, it's like, he speaks, he answers, he speaks, it's like, and they come in, the three friends, the first three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, come and sit with Job for 7 days. Okay, days, 7 days, silently, sit silently for 7 days, kind of thing. I mean, I can't imagine sitting for 7 minutes. You're going to go talk to somebody. Okay, look, Ed, we need to talk here. You sit there, and I'm going to sit here, and then I'm just going to not say anything. We'll start the conversation next Sunday. How long is either Ed or I going to last? Okay, and again, I mean, it's 7 days. Okay, that's a long time to be, even at this point. It's still a long time to be sitting there. But yeah. But it is, yeah. I'm not, I'm saving the whole discussion of Hebrew poetry till we get to Psalms. But Job is, I mean, there are elements of poetry in Genesis and Exodus as well. We'll talk about that more when we get to Psalm. But is that it doesn't translate well into English because it has to do a lot with structure and sounds that are meter, that are, it's kind of like, sometimes you're singing a song, and the way it works. I was thinking about this today. I don't know this for a fact, but I suspect it. So we were singing a song today in church that there was a middle verse which just didn't sound right to me of the song. And I suspect, and I've seen this happen before, where somebody takes a classics hymn and writes another stanza and then is able to copyright it, that song with that stanza, and make money off of the work of John Wesley or Charles Wesley kind of thing. And then whenever you see that, it's like there's always, it's like just like the meter is not right, or something is just not, just the way the words flow isn't right. Now maybe it's just I never memorized this one. I don't know. But I digress. I'll cut that whole part out of this particular thing. So, any other questions? All right, next week we will talk about Exodus. We will talk about the the Exodus, and we may even touch on the role of the Exodus in modern theology, getting into the world of liberation theology, which is kind of an interesting universe to go into. So, all right, thank you very much. See you guys next week.